Support for the Living Wisdom podcast is provided by InTouch Pharmaceuticals, a long-term care pharmacy committed to meeting the specialized pharmaceutical needs of their clients. Visit InTouchPharma.com. Well, we are so appreciative that you are joining us again. I'm Karsten alongside Deb Carriveau, and we got to talking a little bit about dementia and Alzheimer's. And I said, wait, there are so many more aspects of dementia. Not everybody has Alzheimer's. And so, of course, I wanted to pick your brain a little bit about what those other types are. You said Alzheimer's is probably the most commonly known,
it is,
right?
Correct, yep.
So you put together a list of 4 others that are pretty prominent and that fall under dementia. And we do want to say this is not for you to self-diagnose at home. This is just to make sure we are catering to all of our audience because we know not everybody has Alzheimer's.
Yes.
So it's interesting because we say dementia and I remember meeting you and saying, what's the difference between dementia and Alzheimer's?
Right.
And really that's kind of where we're going to start with this series.
Right. So one of the things that's going to be important for people to understand as we move forward in this series is that when we use that term dementia, that in itself is not a disease process. What that term dementia refers to is a group of symptoms. We like to refer to it as an umbrella term, which means we have this umbrella which represents a group of symptoms. But under that umbrella are all kinds of different brain diseases that cause those symptoms that we know as dementia.
Yeah.
So the 4 kinds of dementia that we're going to talk about are the 4 most common ones that people in their life's path will encounter. Most common one is Alzheimer's disease. Second most common is a vascular type of dementia. And then we're also going to talk about Lewy body dementia and also Pick's disease, or people may hear that referred to as the frontotemporal lobe kind of dementia. So again, our intent is to just give people information about what are these different kinds of dementia, what causes those different kinds of dementia, and what is it that I need to know about that in terms as a caregiver. What are we going to encounter? So it's really about understanding what it is people are dealing with.
Yeah, and what I love is you broke it up in a way that we can really kind of follow along and compare and contrast each one. So we are going to start with Alzheimer's. Obviously, we talked about dementia and that umbrella term. So I guess the question is, what is Alzheimer's disease?
So Alzheimer's disease is one specific brain disorder, or you'll hear people talk about it as a neurogenic kind of disease of the brain. And all that means is that it's a disease process that somehow destroys or disables brain cells as the disease goes forward. Now, what happens for people with Alzheimer's disease is that eventually, as things progress, people lose their ability to be able to function normally on a day-to-day basis. What it is not, and sometimes what a lot of people get confused about, is that those symptoms we see with Alzheimer's disease is not part of normal aging. It's a very specific clinical kind of disease of the brain.
The best example I feel like you said to me was, it's not forgetting where you put your car keys, it's forgetting what your keys are used for.
That's exactly right. So
And
that's
that really
kind of
stuck.
when it crosses, because we all, as we get stressed and busy in our
Where's my
lives,
phone every
we
day?
misplace things all the time. But, when we find our phone, we go, oh, there's our phone.
Right.
Okay. The difference is for somebody with Alzheimer's disease, they might find the phone and try to control the TV with it and not recognize what it is.
And obviously, as we've talked about a lot in the past and a lot in the old episodes, is these simple skills that you're forgetting. So these simple tasks and ways to do that. So that makes sense. I guess a lot of people probably once diagnosed are wondering what causes this. Can we stop it? And that's the big question, right? That everyone's fighting to figure out.
Yeah, and we still don't fully understand the disease of Alzheimer's. There are some things that we do know about it. So one of those things is there's a specific chemical in the brain that our body produces that helps electric signals, if you will, pass from one brain cell to another. So we all have chains of brain cells that do different things. This one particular chemical called acetylcholine, for whatever reason, and this is one of the big mysteries with Alzheimer's disease, is why does this happen to some people and not all people
Right.
as they age, is that that chemical becomes lower in terms of the amount of production. It also loses its capacity to be taken up by brain cells and keep brain cells functional. When that happens, when that chemical is absent, it also changes the nature and configuration of brain cells. And so people develop this inflammatory brain process, and that in turn causes the surface of the brain to become what we would call sticky. And so there's these abnormal deposits of protein, amyloid protein, tau proteins, that become this plaque and tangle process that you hear people talk about in the brains of people with Alzheimer's disease. And that is what starts killing brain cells.
Oh, that's
Yeah.
sad.
It is.
Honestly is. And in my head, I was immediately thinking, why can't you then take a supplement, right? If you're diminishing this certain thing, but then it's not even just that issue, it's the receptors, right? So it's kind of this
it's a
twofold.
combination of things. The other thing that contributes to it, we know at some level, is just the way that circulation changes as people age, blood flow to the brain changes, oxygenation, people that have other kinds of illnesses related to general aging, all of those things kind of contribute to the risk factors. And then we also know there's a very specific genetic link of a specific kind of Alzheimer's disease that you can see in people's bloodlines. So sometimes it is just genetics that set you up.
That's what I was going to say. So if a mom has it, will that for sure be passed on to their kids?
No, not for sure. There is some testing now that can be done where people can tell you whether or not you carry this APO4 gene that is a genetic marker. But it does not tell you whether you're going to contract or develop the disease.
Okay. So you could have the marker but not get it.
That's correct.
And then of course that leads to that question of, do you want to know?
That's exactly right. And there's a lot of mixed feelings about that, because if you could find out and there was something you could do well in advance to offset the disease, that kind of thing, then it might be beneficial. But there's just not anything at this point in time other than the things that we already know about lowering your risk factor in terms of just general heart health, staying active, keeping your mind stimulated, those kinds of things. There's not a whole lot beyond that. Now, people who choose to get the testing, the genetic testing, do so because they want to know to do advanced planning. So if and when I might get this, do I have all my ducks in a row in terms of how I want things to go?
Well, that's what I was going to say. Maybe there's more saving that goes on, so you know that you can help your loved one by, care later on.
That and designating, who you want your advocates to be, estate planning, all those kinds of things.
And maybe you would change the way you live day to day, I don't know. It's a catch-22, honestly.
Yep.
You mentioned a little bit about health factors, kind of worrying about, being diabetic or obesity or your heart health. Do those things really change whether or not you get dementia, or I should say Alzheimer's, or does it slow the process?
So what it does is basically it just lowers your risk factor. Okay, so the healthier you are in general with all of those things, the lower your risk becomes to develop it. Doesn't really impact genetics and that kind of thing that might be linked, but what it does do is it may give you the option to have an offset for a longer period of time of symptoms the healthier you are.
That's interesting you say that, because a little side note, I remember meeting and talking with a chiropractor years ago, and he said, he had all these risk factors in his family for several different things, and he controls that by what he eats and his health. And he goes, if I can stay the healthiest I can, my goal is to keep those dormant, that they don't actually transpire. And I thought that was interesting. And then again, it comes into how disciplined you are, because we have temptation all around us,
Right.
right? It's really
Correct.
difficult. Well, let's talk a little bit about signs and symptoms.
Okay.
Obviously, we've talked a lot about kind of the early stage, middle stage, and late stage, and that changes over time
Right.
with Alzheimer's. But signs and symptoms, where do you even want to start with that?
So in general, all those things that we talk about in terms of signs of dementia, you're going to see in people who've been diagnosed with an active Alzheimer's disease. But just to review some of that. So people are going to experience problems with word finding when they're trying to communicate or get a thought from in my head to out here to another person. They're going to struggle with finding the right word, putting words together, even comprehending things that they read, understanding communication that other people are providing. All of that becomes a bigger challenge as the disease progresses.
Yeah.
They also start to lose their ability for good judgment and good reasoning. One of the things that happens with Alzheimer's disease is that people lose the ability to understand consequences of their actions. So lots of times they make poor decisions, they use poor judgment just because they don't understand any longer, if I do this, what this could mean,
Right.
okay? They also become extremely impulsive individuals, so they will act without thinking. That's part of how a person's personality might change, some of the behavior that might change related to the disease process. Oftentimes people will repeat the same story or the same question over and over again in very short periods of time, because the area of the brain where Alzheimer's disease starts is in what we call the hypothalamus. That's the area of the brain related specifically for memory. And so usually the first characteristic we recognize in somebody who is experiencing an active Alzheimer's disease is memory loss, and it is short-term memory. So that's the first area to go. So oftentimes people lose the ability to remember that I just told you this thing 15 minutes ago.
Yeah.
Okay. The other thing that people with Alzheimer's disease experience is a process we call retrogenesis. And people may or may not be familiar with that term, but lots of times people will talk about it, how people age in the reverse way, okay? And in actuality, what retrogenesis is it means that as the disease progresses through the brain, I am losing not just memory, but skill, ability, experiences in the reverse way. I acquired them in my life. I tell people, if you think about it like an onion, as people are going through this process, layers of their onion are being stripped away.
Yeah.
And whatever is in that layer, whatever I learned, whatever skills I had, whatever I experienced in my lifetime may be gone. And so my sense of reality, my sense of self, my sense of time, my sense of other people I have relationships with change because of that layering process. And so lots of times for you and I, our outermost layer of our onion is right here today, what we're experiencing. But for people with dementia, if I'm well into middle to moderate stage dementia, I might be living, my outermost layer of my onion might be when I was an 18-year-old stud muffin, not an 85-year-old individual, you know, who was a carpenter my whole life.
I mean, I still live my 18-year-old stud muffin life every day. I'm going to be honest. I still feel that. But no, you're right.
That's called fantasy.
Well, my fantasy is very nice. I'd love to stay in this fantasy.
There you go.
No, but you're right. We talk a lot about that toddler phase too, and kind of going eventually through that, and even needing help picking out clothes and the order in which the clothes go on.
So when we talk about that kind of reference as a toddler kind of situation, what I want people to understand is we're not talking about intellect. It's not that people who go through this necessarily become some kind of more, what do I want to say, more impaired in terms of being an 85-year-old adult. What happens is the way the disease is destroying the different lobes of the brain, the way my brain is able to process information changes and reverts back to an earlier stage. So when we talk about toddler kinds of level of function, we're talking about the way brain processes information, how I understand steps of a task, how
Right.
I understand and follow instructions, what my attention span looks like, those kinds of things.
That impulse, that anger,
Right,
that frustration.
exactly right. My emotional reactions, those kinds of things.
Yeah.
And the other thing that's important for people to understand is, although I lose memory, so I may not remember a conversation that you and I had 20 minutes ago, okay? But what people with Alzheimer's disease do retain is what we call emotional memory. So I may not remember what you did or what you said, but I will always remember how you made me feel.
Yeah, I love that.
Yeah.
Honestly, that's really sweet. A few other things that you have here, trouble handling finances or bills, so that kind of comes into play, which
Early
makes
on,
sense.
you start to, that's one of the first kind of signs that families will start to notice. Either mom or dad stops paying bills, or they pay the same bill multiple times. That also puts individuals in a position where they're also very high risk to be taken advantage of. So lots of times people start to recognize, oh, they don't remember paying, or they don't remember giving me money. And so they can be victimized and very easily convinced to do something that is not necessarily beneficial for them, but for the person taking advantage of that. I remember I had a lady that I met who had a very large piece of property, and she used to do all her own landscaping, mowing, taking care of her property. And there came a time in her dementia disease where she no longer could understand how to use the mower. But what she thought it was that the mower wasn't functional. So she reached out to a salesperson and said, hey, my mower's not working, I need to buy a new mower. And they ended up selling her a $9,000 mower, knowing her situation. So it's those kinds of things that people can just be very easily taken advantage of, and why advocacy for people by loved ones is such an important thing.
Oh my gosh, that makes my heart break. Increased anxiety or aggression, again, that makes sense with kind of not really understanding maybe what's going on, your surroundings, forgetting where you've been, everything like that.
So one of the things that comes with this process of Alzheimer's disease is that people start to lose the ability to understand that things for them are changing. And so sometimes there's this emotional reaction to other people or to circumstances in their life that become very frustrating, can be very terrifying, can produce a lot of anxiety. Think about, going someplace like the grocery store that you've gone your whole life, and the next time you go, you get lost. You don't know where you're at. You don't know how to get home. Those things are extremely terrifying for people and very, very real. So lots of times when you see those emotional, behavioral kinds of changes, it's based on the reaction to what's happening to me. And lots of times I have lots of difficulty sharing that with people or being open about that, especially early in the process. Individuals have a tendency to want to cover things, not tell people what's happening, because they just don't want people to identify that they're different.
It's hard because they start forgetting family members, friends.
Right.
Again, there's still that emotional connection that you said. So they know that they feel something with them. They just they can't place a name.
Right. I remember when my dad was going through his dementia process, there came a time when he no longer recognized that I was his daughter, but thought I was his sister. He knew I was somebody he loved. He knew I was somebody he wanted to be with and spend time with. He just lost what our connection was. Yeah.
And really that doesn't matter if
No.
you share the love, right?
Yeah, that's right.
You say rummaging, shadowing, sundowning. What
Yeah.
does all of that mean?
So one of the things that happens for people with an Alzheimer's disease process is they have this overwhelming need to be busy or feel productive, right? And so it's very common for these individuals to constantly be looking for something to do, to be looking for my stuff, to feel like, I'm looking around and all the people around me are busy, people are working, they're cooking, they're doing laundry, everybody's doing something. I feel like I should be too.
Okay.
The problem is when people don't get assistance in finding structured things to do, they go look for it on their own. And typically it's going to be someplace and with something that you don't necessarily want them to engage with.
Absolutely, yes.
So it's one of the reasons why something that's important for caregivers is to kind of try to identify and provide that what they see as purposeful activity or purposeful work in order to get individuals to engage, be stimulated, and be directed in terms of where those kinds of things should happen. The other issue in terms of sundowning happens. From beginning to end of the Alzheimer's disease process, the way the brain cells are being destroyed and the way the mass of the brain starts to shrink, from beginning of the disease to end of life, people with Alzheimer's disease end up with a brain about 1/3 the size of the rest of us.
Wow.
So there's a lot of shrinkage that happens. There's a lot of changes that are happening in terms of brain chemistry. And so people who are going through this process get overwhelmed, overstimulated, just have a lot of difficulty keeping up with the world and the people around them and all the data that we have inputting into our brains over the course of the day. By the time they get to that late afternoon, early evening time frame, when they start to get sensitive to light changes, the sun's going down, the time of day is changing, their bodies and their minds are just completely exhausted frequently by that time of the day. And so it really is about the fact they get to the point where they are just overstimulated, can't take in any more data. What we were referring to before when we talked about that toddler phase or preschooler phase that people get into as they're progressing into the disease process and the way their brain can process information. Think about having a preschooler or a toddler who doesn't get a nap in the afternoon.
Yes.
What do you see?
Yeah.
It's those same kinds of emotional overloads, those too much stimulation.
Yeah.
My brain just needs a time out.
Yeah.
I just need to be able to rest and recoup.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what that scenario that we see is about.
Yeah, that makes sense. Let's talk a little bit about how this is diagnosed and treated. Do we
Okay.
want to start with the diagnosis and how
Sure.
that all works?
Sure. So typically the only way to know 100% for sure that somebody has Alzheimer's disease is with an autopsy after death.
Oh, interesting.
And what they do is they will look at specific pieces of brain tissue and look for that characteristic plaque and tangle process from those tau and amyloid proteins that we talked about a little earlier. So that's the only way to know for sure. Typically, how a diagnosis happens while the person is still living is that people will put these individuals through just standard medical testing. And what they're doing is ruling out all the other things it might be. So going through CAT scans or MRIs, they'll look for what we call brain atrophy. Are there areas of the brain that are shrinking, that look like they're being impacted by this kind of a process? They will put people through a series of lab work because there are a lot of things like abnormal levels of electrolytes or B12 or other kinds of medical things that could cause an individual to look like they have some form of dementia. But if all of that's normal,
Right.
then you're kind of ruling those things out. So a lot of the process of diagnosis is all this testing and ruling out of things. And if all of that stuff comes back as normal, then what you're left with during a lifetime is a probable diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease. But nobody will know for sure 100% until we do that autopsy.
Ultimately, though, what if you're seeing kind of the loved one progress through this
Right.
early, middle, late stage?
Right. Right. And you also know that what you're seeing is a dementia process.
Yeah.
Sometimes what's not known is what kind of dementia it
Okay,
is. That's
okay.
why it's so important that people, as you're dealing with this with a loved one, really get to a neurologist, a neuropsychologist that can do very specific testing and looking for very specific kinds of things that help us understand that, yes, these are typically the characteristics of Alzheimer's versus some other kind of dementia.
Right. So first step is probably the family physician, right? But ultimately, that's not where you're going to get your
Correct.
diagnosis
Correct.
from. Okay. As much as we want to say that there is going to be a treatment, there is no. I mean,
So there is no treatment that ends in a cure.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yes.
Treatment typically falls into two categories when we're dealing with an individual with Alzheimer's disease. One is symptom management. So the drugs that people commonly hear about, things like Aricept, Namenda, Exelon, those medications are medications that were designed specifically to help slow the progression of the symptoms that come with Alzheimer's disease. Now, frequently what people don't necessarily understand is that those medications do more than just assist with memory and cognitive enhancement. Because of that, people will say, oh, it's not helping her memory anyway, let's stop it.
Oh, okay.
And what I need people to know and to understand that there are many studies out there, lots of evidence, things that I have experienced personally in the years of my career, where if we take an individual with Alzheimer's disease off of those medications too soon, what we see rapidly decline is a person's level of function in terms of just physically being able to function and understand and identify how to continue to do things for myself.
Interesting.
So how to feed myself, understanding how to put my pants up and down, recognizing when I have to go to the bathroom, being able to continue to ambulate safely. So a lot of those pieces of life that are about just daily functional kinds of things, those are the things that we see rapidly decline if we take people off of those medications early and based on just the idea that it's not helping memory or cognitive issues. There's still such a benefit well into the later part of the disease in terms of level of function that we want to maintain. The other thing research has shown is if we take someone off those medications and we see that rapid decline, we have a window of about 7 to 14 days to restart that medication if there's any hope of ever getting that person back to where they were. So it happens very quickly.
Interesting. So there's that medication aspect. And then we've talked a lot about, the hard parts where you kind of see, even in movies at times, some individuals placed in homes and they're just spend their days sitting.
Yeah.
And you were saying that movement, activities, all of that helps slow the progression of Alzheimer's.
So one of the things that we tell people is kind of a golden rule of thumb when you're dealing with somebody with an Alzheimer's disease process, and that is understanding that in order to slow down this disease process and in order for me as that individual to have the best quality of life, you need to allow me to be an active participant in my life. As soon as I start sitting idly, as soon as people start doing things for me and not with me, all of the neural connections between head and body and what I'm capable of doing starts to degrade. That old adage that we hear all the time, if you don't use it, you lose it,
Yeah.
that is gospel truth for
Yeah.
people living with Alzheimer's disease. So it's extremely important that caregivers keep people engaged, that you let me do whatever I can do at whatever level I can do it. If all I know how to do is to hold that coffee cup in my hand and I don't know how to take it to my mouth and take a drink, you still need to let me hold that cup and just guide me through it. Because as soon as you take that cup out of my hand and you start holding it, there's automatically a degradation of that ability and skill and neural connection between head and my hand that starts to happen.
Wow.
And for the longer period of time I don't do that, the faster that progression happens. So as much as we want to think doing things like putting somebody in front of the TV keeps them stimulated or occupied, that is not what's beneficial.
Yeah.
What's beneficial is that you continue to allow me to actively engage in things to give me as much normalization in the routine and structure of my life on a day-to-day basis as possible. That's what's going to slow things down and
Yeah.
keep me functional longer.
Well, and we really encourage you to look at previous episodes because we really break down when we go through that early, middle, and late stage and talk about things that you can do with your loved one to keep them stimulated, which is just so important.
Yep.
Dementia, how early, or again, I keep saying dementia, right? That's the problem. It's
Yeah.
in my head, dementia,
Yeah.
but Alzheimer's, how early does that hit? Can it hit someone in their 30s? Is it later? Does it just depend on genetics?
So there are two different categories of Alzheimer's when we look at it. There's what we call the typical or late onset, which means that the person is diagnosed and develops symptomology after 65 or older.
Okay.
We know that the highest percentage of incidence happens to people over the age of 80. So the older you get, the higher your risk factor is, the greater your chance is that you're going to develop it. And then there's also a category of Alzheimer's disease called early onset. And that means that symptomology and diagnosis happens 64 or earlier.
Wow.
Okay. My own personal experience is the youngest person I've ever met or encountered in my career path with early onset was about 38.
Wow.
It's much more common to see it occur in midlife, so 40s, 50s typically, but it can be earlier depending on genetics. We know that the early onset type of dementia has a much stronger genetic link to it than the typical kind that just seems to randomly happen to people.
Yeah. Remind me the life expectancy once diagnosed.
So if someone has the typical kind, that typically lifespan from the time of diagnosis, which is generally when people get well into that moderate kind of dementia when everybody starts to notice there's changes. Typically somewhere between 7 and 10 years.
Okay.
I have seen it go on as long as 15 and as short as 5. So it depends also on a person's general physical health and whether they have any other what we call comorbidities or other age-related kinds of illnesses. For early onset, the tendency of lifespan seems to be shorter, tends to be more like 2 to 5 years.
Wow.
But a lot of it is dependent on how young the person is when they're diagnosed. We know the trend and pattern seems to be the younger a person contracts the disease, the shorter the lifespan is.
Well, that was a lot. I know that's just, we want to dive in as much as we can to these to provide as much information.
Right.
Is there anything else when it comes to Alzheimer's that you think we didn't touch on?
I would just say that, all forms of dementia that people are going to face are extremely challenging. Each one kind of has its own group of challenges that are a little different than another kind. But the biggest issue, the biggest factor, I think, in all of this is helping caregivers understand not to try to do this alone.
Yeah.
Okay? It's an extremely challenging care burden. People need to reach out to resources. Alzheimer's and Dementia Services of Northern Indiana, the Alzheimer's Association of Indiana, the National Association out of Chicago, Alzheimer's Foundation of America out of New York. All of those agencies and organizations have all kinds of resources to help you get information, to know where to go, how to find assistance and financial support. There's just all kinds of resources out there. Reaching out to a local, organization to get connected to a support group, either face-to-face in person or online. Lots of agencies now are doing online, long-distance kinds of support groups. The thing that's going to be important is that you know and understand what you're experiencing is not just you. It's very normal. This is a difficult journey. It's a hard process. So let people love you and support you. Don't be afraid to get help or ask for help. I tell people all the time, many of these family caregivers are trying to do with one or two of them what it takes 30 of us around the clock to do. That doesn't make you weak. That doesn't make you inadequate as a daughter or a spouse. It is the nature of the beast. It is the reality of the disease that your loved one is walking through. We just want to support you in that. And, we do a local support group here at, Living Wisdom Center once a month. There's all kinds of, support out there. You just need to reach out and talk to people.
Support for the Living Wisdom podcast is provided by InTouch Pharmaceuticals, a long-term care pharmacy committed to meeting the specialized pharmaceutical needs of their clients. Visit intouchpharma.com.